The gauntlet's coming up. It's one of the only competitive elements that are to PoE. It's one of the only opportunities where you can actually try hard and get something from trying hard. For those who don't know, it's basically a solo stealth-bound hardcore league that's super juiced up, and this time around, Zizarin and his crew have made it into a multiple projectiles league. So last time the gauntlet had increased AoE and a bunch of other damage modifiers. This time it's got multi-proj. So the big thing about Gauntlet is that Gauntlet builds don't need to do the same things that normal builds need to do. For one, most builds don't need to worry about bossing, and the reason I say this is because most people won't worry about bossing. I think last Gauntlet only 3 or 4 people have killed every single boss. The second thing is that Gauntlet builds don't really necessarily need to do damage. It's okay for it to take a long time, especially because this race is a 10-day Gauntlet. Time isn't really that tight of a constraint. There's a lot of things that you can do that you wouldn't necessarily do in a 2 or 3 day race. So it's okay, for example, for a boss kill in a T16 map to take a minute long. And you can see that the only builds that were super high DPS were Carve's General Cry thing and Slams, which this is heavily understated. But if you actually look at my damage from last Gauntlet, it wasn't real high. I mean, 168k, it's not actually that low, but I was able to still push into high reds and T16s and do a little bit of endgame stuff on 2 5 links without 21 gems. Without really any good gear. You don't actually need that much damage. Playstyle is much more important than how much damage you have. The third thing is that Gauntlet builds don't necessarily need to be fun or smooth to play. And what I mean by this is, it is a 10-day race, which is long, but it is only a 10-day race, which is somewhat also short. I'd much rather be alive than really enjoying my smooth playstyle. Now with that said, you do need to ask, what do builds need to be? So in a multi-proj gauntlet, the first thing is survivable. And in terms of survivability in this gauntlet, you want to have layered mitigation for multi-hits. Most of the deaths will be to multi-hit as opposed to one-shots, especially in a multi-proj league. So things like hitting either max dodge or max block are invaluable here. In fact, it's one of the big reasons why a lot of people in this gauntlet think Slayer is very weak until the endgame bossing. Which means that for 99.9% of people playing gauntlet, don't play Slayer, play Gladiator instead. The second thing is about damage uptime. So Gauntlet builds should think of damage in terms of uptime even more than you would normally. So because bosses and everything else within maps have much higher increased movement speed, it becomes even more necessary to think about what sort of uptime you have. So in terms of a skill with good uptime, dot builds tend to be the best off the bat. Minions tend to be quite strong. Anything with projectiles will tend to suffer, especially if those projectiles are relatively slow. Melee obviously suffers a ton this gauntlet, especially because of multi-proj and shotgunning. Playing melee, a pure melee playstyle, is much more dangerous, especially because slams suck now. And lastly, a gauntlet build needs to move. Especially when you want to play a really tough setting, movement is probably the best layer of defense that you can get. And that movement needs to be accessible, it needs to be consistent. So running an Alchemist Quicksilver Flask of Adrenaline, in my opinion, for example, is a huge trap even if you're on Pathfinder, because the moment you run out of charges, you'll be much slower, and it's much more likely that you'll be running out of charges as you're mapping. So let's take a build, for example, Forbidden Right Totems. I don't know why this is, but a lot of softcore players think Forbidden Right Totems is going to be super strong this gauntlet and dominate the race, and if you look at the hardcore community, virtually nobody agrees with that. Firstly, block is actually very inaccessible for Forbidden Right Totems. You need to invest a lot into actually getting defenses to survive. And if you look at the early gauntlet runs that have been on FR totems, as far as practice players go, you'll notice that they play like little bitches. And the reason this is the case is because you have to play super scared with totems. And this gets to the playstyle thing, which is the second major problem of playing FR totems in gauntlet. Because totems take a little while to deploy, and then after they deploy, they take a little while to shoot, there's actually quite a bit of time where you're just standing there and you're about to get bent over by whatever monster or boss sees you. And there's really nothing you can do other than run around and wait for your totems to finally doing something. And then compounding with the playstyle issue, you have this issue of Forbidden Right being fairly slow in terms of projectiles. So you actually do need to invest into projectile speed to make this playable in a normal league. However, monsters are even faster by default in Gauntlet. So FR totems will find that the damage that you get on the tooltip actually suffers even more when you're in Gauntlet, because things are moving so quickly, they actually end up dodging a lot of the projectiles that you shoot out. That said, FR totems is still one of the best bossers, and you probably will see a couple of rerolls into FR totems late into the league, just because of how high the damage is. It's really hard to get enough damage to kill the bosses in GOT, and FR totems is fine, but only for a reroll. It's not a good league starter for this league. And for most players, it's not worth considering at all because it doesn't have those defenses that you want while mapping. So taking those constraints into consideration, this is probably what I'm going to be playing. it's a Fizz dot Sign Ascendant, and there's a couple of reasons why I'm going for this. So firstly, the biggest thing is that Scion is probably a less competitive ascendancy. The most competitive ascendancies this time around will 100% be Shadow as a Saboteur and Ranger as a Raider. So that precludes pretty much every other class. I would have played this as a Deadeye, but Deadeye is competing with Raider, and a lot of good players are playing on Raider. Because of how insanely broken Avatar of the Chase is, this node is probably the best defensive node in the game, and because of this, Ranger is always going to have to be Raider in Gauntlet. The other reason I'm playing for Scion is because not only do you much more easily get to block Cap, Bone Offering with Necromancer is also really helpful because you get recovery from your block. In other words, the thing that Gladiator struggles with when as a spellcaster, recovery, and one-shots, is partially mitigated by going Scion, Necromancer, Gladiator because of the recovery from Necro. Now, the one-shot issue is still a thing because of Gladiator, but you end up just building a ton of life. So early on, I'm going to be leveling with Steel Skills, and I'll be pathing through here. And I think these 5 nodes are probably the laziest way to get started in terms of leveling. They give you a ton of resistances, and you know, I just don't really want to die in Act 1. It's okay if Act 1 takes an hour. It's okay if Act 1 takes 2 hours even, which sounds really extreme, but it's actually totally fine. Acts don't really matter. So if you're trying to emulate Tai Killer, don't. It's just going to get you killed. The early pathing afterwards goes towards Constitution for some flat life, and then over to Relentless. And I will be taking Veteran Soldier as well because the flat life and Fizz damage is quite strong. I then path over to Path of the Warrior, and then I come all the way over here to get these Fizz nodes, ending up with Vanquisher. And so this gives you just about enough damage, and I think enough baseline resist to handle a lot of the Gauntlet mods that you're going to be dealing with early. Especially when you're playing Steel Skills, which is a relatively safe playstyle, this is real strong. Now, at level 30, I'll still be on Steel Skills, but I'll be pathing up towards Sovereignty now. And there's really only one reason for me to go Sovereignty, and that's because I want to go the Spellslinger. Not for endgame, but just early on. So this is the point where whenever this hits, I'll be making a transition towards Spellslinger, and I'll be using Exsanguinate and Corrupting Fever and Reap as my setup. Now, if you don't have the reservation that you need because Spellslinger early on doesn't have as good reservation, you would just use it on a 2 or a 3 link, right? And this is a really strong leveling setup. You start to want to take Fizz dot multi everywhere you can, which is pretty much here and here. You want to get more life, just as much life as you can everywhere. And then you want to start pathing towards here, because Anointed Flesh early on is really good. Before you get the necessary crafts to get ailment immunity, ailment mitigation, especially chill, is really valuable in Gauntlet. You'll notice that you don't actually get frozen that much in the Gauntlet. But man, you get chilled almost all the fucking time. And when you get chilled, you play slower because your action speed is reduced, your movement speed is reduced, even your animations are slower. And this is what it's going to end up getting you killed a lot of the time. And after that, I just take a bunch of life and wherever else, you know, it's kind of a bit freestyle. But at some point I will be taking Resolute Technique. And the reason I like taking Resolute Technique on this build is because you really want Fortify. However, I don't like doing the weapon swap into a Vigilant Strike setup for Fortify, and I personally find the Shield Charge Fortify proc playstyle to be really comfortable. And this isn't just like random speculation, this is through my own testing on Gauntlet practice leagues. I actually kind of like the Shield Charge playstyle. So the lab ascendancies are a bit weird. I'll be going for these 2 nodes with the first lab because you really want attributes, and this additional skill point is worth actually much less than 40% int. At Cruel Lab though, I'll be taking Gladiator, which is maybe the single best node. Maybe. Because you could also argue that Necro, the thing that I'm taking at Merc Lab, is the other single best node. And they're both really good, and they'll get you fairly close to block cap. So after all this, at the very end, I'll be taking Path of the Witch and doing a respec through cast speed to start, and then getting rid of some of this stuff. But this can only happen after I get more ailment mitigation. And if you actually look at my final tree here, I end up dropping Sovereignty and going self-cast. And this probably happens around early red maps, because I've been playing with Spellslinger into yellows so far with relatively scuffed gear at level 85, I think, and level 18 gems, and the damage is still fine at yellows, which means I really don't want to transition away from playing Spellslinger because it's safer. And you can see that the block rate's pretty good. It's at 73-74, and this is a bit contingent on what clusters you end up rolling, but you do want to hit the cap, which isn't hard to do. I mean, I have these nodes right here available to me. And Sanctuary early on is actually a really good set of clusters, especially when you're lacking resistances. But you can see the damage is fairly solid. I would probably say I'm at about 1 million uptime DPS against most bosses. Saying that it's higher than that might be a bit ambitious. It's also different because in a multi-boss setup, my Exsanguinate setup will probably run Chain over Swift Affliction. But Unleash is always there. This in Power 4 is not in Power 4. This is actually Cruelty. A lot of people are gonna be like, oh, why are you running in Power 4? You're not gonna get that. I know I'm not gonna get that. But Cruelty is one of your best supports, and I think this should roughly emulate how good Cruelty is. It might be a bit better, but it can't be by much. Otherwise, I have a Warbanner Generosity set up, so this is basically free. It doesn't cost any more. I got Flesh and Stone and Pride as my 2 other primate auras, and this goes into Blood Stance for bossing, and Sand Stance every other time. You really don't need that much damage while you're mapping, but this blind layer is really helpful, especially when you have block, so you have a ton of mitigation. And then in my wand, which is going to be a trigger wand, and this is what I'll be target farming first. I'll be using Desecrate, Bone Offering, and Poacher's Mark, and this does a lot of benefits. Firstly, these 2 let you hit block cap. They're quintessential for this build. And secondly, Poacher's Mark actually I think does give you frenzies on hit, which is pretty cool. Like, you won't necessarily always have it up, and there might be other things you'll do to get frenzy charges. I got a shield charge fortify set up. I'm gonna be running a guard skill as well. I think I wanted to make this probably a high level steel skin, maybe a molten shell depending on how much armor I get. And Immortal Call is probably a no-go just because it has so little uptime when you have no endurance charges. Now, I can have endurance charges, and the way that I do end up getting that is through a weapon swap. And my weapon swap would have a shield with +2 minimum endurance charges. And basically, when you're running on a map, you just do an instant little weapon swap tap, and you get 2 endurance charges, and then you swap back, and then you'll have these 2 endurance charges ticking for the next 11 seconds, even though you won't have that as your minimum endurance charges anymore. My gearing is really straightforward. This wand is probably the most annoying thing to craft. I'll be doing Reforge, Fizz, whether that's through Harvest or Fossils, and hopefully landing this. It's not a big deal. Spell damage is also a really good mod. Minion damage is also a really good mod, but you really want to be using a Profane Mon base, which has 14% increased cast speed. I kind of manually just put this in. Your shield is kind of important as well. Spell damage again is good here, but Recover 5% life on block is the key mod, and you'll hit this through Harvest. Harvest Recraft Life is the way to do it. Everything else just has damage on it. So Bone Helmets help because I'm taking Spiritual Aid. I think Spiritual Aid is super valuable because it lets you take this pathing through Witch. There's not a lot of good nodes around Witch to get, and you do want to get up here to get Spell Block. An Astral Plate, whatever, but the Reforge with Caster will let you hit this 25% increased effective offerings, which will help your Bone Offering, which again will help you hit block cap. And that's probably what you want to be doing as far as endgame crafting goes. These gloves can be a bunch of different things. Right now I have them set up as, I believe, Delirium, Essence of Delirium crafted gloves, which give you 30% damage over time, and this is where my Corrupting Fever setup is going. I might not use these at all because it's hard to hit a high life roll on these. You'll probably be at 70 life, right? Which isn't horrible, but I'd much rather have T1 life at like 89. Boots can be anything, but you'll notice on both my boots and my gloves I'll be crafting reduced effective shock and chill, and then I have more reduced effective shock and chill from Flexible Sentry. The Jade Amulet, you kind of want to hit Fizz.multi. +1 gems is also just as good, if not better. Awakener Orb, if you get later into the league and get a bit lucky with your early Awakener drops, can be super helpful. But the Anointment Arcane Swiftness costs 2 silver oils, and this is actually fairly reasonable to get in a gauntlet. And this is Arcane Swiftness, right? It gives you Spell Block, Avoid Ailments, which doesn't really help that much. A ton of spell damage because you're hitting Spell Block cap. And some cast speed, which is really helpful for an Unleashed playstyle. You use 2 Vermilions, there's really no way around this. You just need as much life as you can, and then a leather belt I think early on is fine. Obviously this wants to be a Stygian later, but there's things you can roll onto a leather belt, and there's a bunch of mods that I would potentially go for, depending on what influences I hit. The jewels are Simulator 2 props. They can be a bunch of different mods. Fizz.multi is barely better than increases to Fizz damage, but you don't really want to miss max life. And then the small clusters are both block based, and so is the large cluster. Now, the plan with this build is to do everything. I'm obviously not as good of a bosser as most of the people that you'll be watching on stream pushing this race, but I'm also not going to be like Steel Maging my hideout all day. And I think that this particular playstyle is pretty conducive to being an effective bosser, especially because of how much is automated. However, I do have one reach goal, and this is sort of what I'll be testing. March of the Legion is a tier 2 unique. It's on the same level as things like Void Battery, Poet's Pen, that tier of unique, so it's really unlikely to get. But I'll be playing a single reroll character, and I'll be leveling this character up to level 59, or 58, or 57, depends on how Gwenin works, to hopefully get March of the Legion. And I'm going to be testing a bunch of different Astrogali farming strats to see how many I can get, and I'll be rolling a couple thousand today just to see how many it takes on average to get a March of the Legion from Astrogali farming with Gwenin. And the reason why I really want March of the Legion is because it lets me use this as my aura setup. which pushes my damage to something like 2 mil. And that's 2 mil with haste, so everything feels way better if I can do this. Now this is a reach goal, and I'm not expecting this to necessarily be the case. But the thing is, once you hit level 95 in Gauntlet, have most of your gear crafted, there's really nothing else to strive for other than setting up for boss kills. All in all, I don't really know how this Gauntlet's gonna go. It's gonna be pretty wild, and I don't expect a lot of people to kill every boss. I definitely don't expect to kill every boss. In fact, I'll be happy if I can take down 3 to 4 of the boss encounters. But this build is actually really easy to hit level 90 with, and you don't need to push anything higher than white maps if you want to be really safe hitting level 90. It's got a smooth playstyle, you never need to transition out of Spellslinger if you don't want to do any of the endgame stuff. And by being max block, having a decent amount of recovery, and being able to just build whatever you want, and stack a ton of life makes this a really nice build for Gauntlet. So we'll see how this goes. It could be interesting.